Meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars begin to interfere with America's expanding shipping industry.
It was a lose-lose situation of how to negotiate the troubled waters in the Napoleonic Wars. It's important to keep in mind that the Jeffersonians, as much as the Federalists, were determined to maintain neutrality. So the dilemma for Jefferson is that belligerent talk and the effort to vindicate neutral rights went for him hand in hand with a failure to prepare.
In the interim, what Jefferson sought to do was to impose an embargo. And that put the Customs Service in a very difficult position because, of course, they saw themselves as developing and articulating what this commercial republic was and how it ought to develop further and prosper. And yet here was Thomas Jefferson saying we had to put essentially restrictions on that by imposing an embargo.
The embargo triggers a serious economic depression. Hardest hit are the merchants and ship owners of the Northeast, most of them Federalists.
It's one of the great tragic set pieces of American political history. It led Jefferson into wholesale invasions of civil rights and liberties, trying to keep Americans from trading abroad. It was logistically impossible and required the use of federal power in the court systems in a way that was effectively nullified throughout much of New England. In fact, Jefferson's reverence or respect for local self-government was reinforced by New England's resistance to his embargo. But of course, the ultimate disaster was that that war came nonetheless, and it was called Mr. Madison's War, but it was really Mr. Jefferson's war.
The election of James Madison as president in 1808 continues the procession of Republican presidents from Virginia, although the Federalists capture an increased number of votes. In his final days in office, Jefferson signs a bill to lift the embargo.
Jefferson dealt in large generalities and in principles that he didn't question deeply. Madison went over those in detail, and he had a quizzical mind, and he kept chopping up these questions into small pieces and trying to figure out the intricacy of them in ways that Jefferson and no other person at the time really did. He was the foremost intellect of that era. However, unlike Jefferson, he was not a good administrator. He was not a very good politician.
The politician in the Madison family is the president's wife, Dolly.
She had a warm, accessible personality. She was very charming. She was very social. And her husband, James Madison, was almost the opposite. He was very shy. Often people wouldn't even notice him at his own parties. I think it's a clue that they were very similar in height. But everybody describes Dolly Madison as this sort of larger-than-life figure, and James Madison as this sort of tiny, wizened little schoolmaster who looked like he just whipped one of his schoolboys. He seems the embodiment of the sober, virtuous Republican. But Dolly Madison does all the political stuff that the country needs.
Indian uprisings, encouraged and supported by British agents in Canada, and the cutoff of trade with Europe, pushed the nation toward conflict with Great Britain.
Congress was divided over whether or not to declare war on Great Britain. And in fact, it was this issue that resulted in the congressional overturn of 1810, which replaced some huge proportion of the members of Congress, and there was a new group in town, the War Hawks, led by John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, and they wanted war. James Madison, for the most part, did not want war, but it became clear to some people, including to Dolly Madison, that he would never win the presidential election of 1812 unless he did.
There's some reason to think that the embargo and later non-intercourse acts did have a long-term effect on the British, and that the British were getting ready to deal. They withdrew their orders of council just before the Americans declared war.